I'm going to let you catch your breath and maybe get a glass of water as we jump into some of the questions here. So we've got a bunch of questions that come in, but please, if you've got additional ones, post them in the chat. But I'm going to put Dr. Brennan on the spot to start. And the first question we have here is, other than the scale, how does the success at Vimy Ridge compare to that of Hill 70? Dr. Brennan, over to you.
Well, actually, there isn't. I mean, it is a smaller scale. Hill 70. Hill 70 is sort of two battles. I mean, there's a great debate in the historical community between those who believe it's sort of two battles, and that Lons was really separate and in many ways a failure. Hill 70, of course, was a brilliant successor, whether it's just one battle and so on. But it was on a slightly lesser scale. But I would argue there isn't, apart from that distinction, okay, if one subscribed to it, I happen to. I know my friend Tim Cook does not, and so on. But anyway, that there isn't a lot of difference between the two. The types of things that were done, the doctrine that was applied, and so on and so forth was pretty similar. The big difference, of course, I suppose, is Currie as commander for the first time. A Canadian commands the Canadian Corps, and one might have expected a few bumps in his first battle as Corps commander. But anyway, no, I think they're comparable. And of course, one of the tragedies only recently remedied by volunteers in the private sector, in effect, is that there was no memorial for Hill 70 Lons until just a couple of years ago. And how it was left out of the list to be commemorated is kind of amazing. And that is, or it's not amazing, it's hard to comprehend. And that's, in a sense, evidence to show, at least in my opinion, that there was very little to choose between the two battles in sort of what they told us about Canadian arms and Canadian fighting ability and so on and so forth.
Perfect, thank you very much. All right, Jeff, I'm going to jump back to you. We're going to probably just go back and forth if that works for everybody. So how does Canada deliver education and remembrance without crossing the line of glorifying war, which is often distasteful to many Canadians?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, and certainly a focus for the Vimy Trap book, and I think for Tim Cook's book as well, and other scholars who are looking at this, as well as managers of sites. There's no easy answer to that. I think the thing is there has to be a deep respect for those who lost their lives. I think it's about watching the jingoism. As much as we as Canadians want to focus on our Canadian story, I think if we are able to also understand the broader narrative and to understand the experience of other countries, it gives us a greater perspective on the sacrifices made by others and the tremendous loss of life in the First World War. And I think it begins to put things into perspective that many nations had their sense of birth, such as Australia, but also many nations lost the cream of their youth at that time. So I think understanding the history, understanding the strategies and tactics is important, and also understanding the toll beyond the actual war is important.
Excellent, thank you. And maybe what we'll do two and then bounce back to Dr. Brennan for two, so I don't have Toki having to play to jump back and forth between you. So the second question for Jeff, how do you see the idea of visiting overseas memorial sites evolving to a post-pandemic world?
So I do a lot of work, as you can see, on the tourism side. I think we're basically seeing a lot of people itching to go travel again. I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way about going back and visiting some of these places. I think that the larger issue will be how we maybe try to expand beyond places such as Vimy Ridge, and try to expand our knowledge and our learning by going to other places. So I think the whole thing around tourism and working with those battlefield guides that are knowledgeable and that can provide experiences that allow us to link into these other stories. You know, and I'm sure we're mostly interested in our Canadian stories, and there are many of them there. You know, even the idea of, are there projects out there such as building trails, a trail system where we could actually, you know, and I find the 100 Days area quite a fascinating area because it's so open and relatively remote. There's not a lot of villages in the area, and lots of farmers' fields. And what an opportunity to have some kind of trail system that would allow people to walk that trail and to learn another part of the Great War history. So I think it's about figuring out new ways to look at how we remember, and then also have activities that allow us to reflect on how we take those ideas and use them in the present day.
Thanks, Jeff. Interestingly, one of the projects Valour Canada's initial stages working on, it's not Vimy related, but it's a walking trail through Sicily and the Operation Husky area. So that's connecting the geography and the stories is interesting. Okay, I'm going to jump back to Dr. Brennan. Could you speak to some of the logistical challenges that the Germans faced in defending Vimy? I know you mentioned in your talk, geography was a big piece of that, but perhaps you could expand a little bit on it.
The biggest single problem I had was not being able, as I said, to implement defense in depth properly, because there was a substantial gap in between their defense, the existing defensive perimeter, right, a sort of a line at the top of the ridge, which was measured in hundreds of meters deep. And when they could sort of resume it again, because they couldn't resume it simply at flat country at the bottom of the ridge, because on the assumption that we got to the top, or at least some of us got to the top, then there would be artillery spotting and so on. So they had to, the very height of the ridge, the steepness of some of the terrain precludes them doing what they would like to have done, and then the very height, on the assumption that the attackers will capture it. And the impact that it has on artillery spotting, accurate artillery spotting, means they have to pull back a long ways. Certainly, the logistical problems they faced, I think that sort of explains the problem of having the reserves so far back. But, and a thin crust, basically, which of course we broke through, and then that was that. The situation after we'd broken through, well, you know, any German forces coming up, and they had substantial, not as much as they should have had. We outnumbered them about 4-1, but they had substantial forces that could have been brought forward. But they simply too much artillery observation going on, and you know, they would have been massacred. Which is, you know, they were smart enough to pull back and hunker down more or less out of the range of our artillery spotting and our artillery, and reconstitute their line. And in fact, when you stand up on Vimy Ridge, it was a good view of it. In one of Jeff's pictures of the grieving mother, in the distance, about 7 kilometers away, you see the coal slag heaps of Lens. And you know, we got there in August, but middle of August 1918. So I mean, April, May, June, July, 4 months it took us to cover that distance, because the Germans had, you know, pulled back because they realized that logistically and otherwise there was no point in trying to occupy that area. They in fact withdrew completely.
Perfect. And this question might be a bit of a broad one, but I'll let you tackle the specific part. But I know you're writing the history of the King's Own Cavalry Regiment, and they perpetuate the 50th Battalion from the First World War. Do you have any maybe anecdotes from the 50th? I know they took the ground where the memorial sits today that you'd like to share with the group.
Yeah, one of the points, you know, bear with me here. I'm getting to the point. One of the things that students often came up with when I would talk to them about bite and hold attacks and how it was, you know, designed to be much more efficient and so on and so forth, and effective, is they would point to the casualty list, the butcher's bill at Vimy, which is pretty grim. You know, Canada has almost 4.5 times as many people today. So you just multiply all those figures by 4.5, and you think of that happening 96 hours. Okay, and it's horrific. Okay, the casualty list. And in the case of the 50th Battalion, they were part of the 4th Division, which only went into action, last division to form, and only went into action toward the tail end of the Somme. So for about half of their soldiers, the 50th Battalion was their first battle. They had a brand new commanding officer just appointed less than a month before the attack. The so-called quiet times, it wasn't very quiet before then. There was a lot of raiding going on and so on, a lot of casualties. But the point is that there was a lot of, they use the terrible term wastage, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, there was a lot of them in their first battle. They lose half their men. Half the men committed by the time they take the Pimple on the 12th. They have lost half their soldiers, killed or wounded. And many of them, of course, will come back, but an awful lot of them, the wounded I'm talking about, will not come back. And at the time, there was very little talk among the ordinary soldiers. They were conscious that they had used new techniques, empowered platoons and all of this sort of stuff. And they were generally favorably exposed towards the destruction wrought by the preliminary bombardment and by the effectiveness most of the times when they attacked of the creeping barrages or the rolling barrages. But there was very little, changed for them. And there was very little sense that they were proud of the achievement, but there was very little sense they tried anything new and that people like me would be rabbiting on years later about how this was the most important thing determined at Vimy was not birth of a nation, but the verification of this template for attack, which the VEF and certainly the Canadian Corps used religiously right to the end of the war with some considerable success. There are a lot of individual stories of again what we read about in books about as officers are killed, as senior NCOs are killed, ordinary soldiers have to rise up and under the most horrific conditions and lead men, and battles are won and lost by small groups of infantry and by individuals who rise to the occasion, and it's impossible to predict who is going to be brave and so on and so forth. It's an awful lot of stories like that I've come across. And then the tremendous sense of grief. Certainly in the aftermath of the battle, as I said, there was, I think the 50s was typical in that the survivors were extraordinarily proud of what had been achieved. On the other hand, people were just numb by the losses. They were given time off, except they had to go help bury the dead, which in the case of the Germans, they weren't buried. They were piled in huge funeral pyres burning on the bridge and giving off this nauseating smoke from burning flesh and so on. Rather like it was a bunch of Hindu soldiers who were being buried, but there's only way to get rid of them quick enough. And stuff like that. It just, there was none, maybe the glory sank in later, but, and what had been achieved, but other than a feeling that something great had been achieved and they've been part of it, the effect of combat, one is left in awe of what these men went through. Really, I really am. That doesn't quite answer the question, but it's best I can do.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Brennan. And I'll give you a break for a second. And Jeff, I got a question for you, and I think you and I have spoken about this in the past. But for any of those who might have followed it, the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo was a couple of years ago, and we saw great reenactments on the battlefield, horses and soldiers marching around and shooting blank rounds at one another. So if you were predicting, what would the 200th anniversary of Vimy Ridge look like for Canadians?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The whole thing of, well, let's just speak to reenactment for a moment, because our American friends with the American Civil War have often focused on reenactments, and that has declined over time as younger generations just haven't picked up on it. And so there's one thing with this whole idea of reenactment. However, when you go to Normandy, they have another issue where they have a lot of people showing up in uniforms and of varying degrees of accuracy, shall we say. And some of them are dressing in German uniforms. And in France, they've actually created a rule or laws that prevent people from wearing, in the case of Second World War, German uniforms. If they're outside like a specific area, like if it's a demonstration area, they can wear them in there, but they can't walk down the streets of St. Mary Glees wearing an SS uniform. So they've really clamped down on controlling that. The First World War, I think, has a different feel to it, obviously, but some of the same issues may still apply as about glorification. I guess this goes to your earlier question, is what is seen as remembering well and what is seen as a little bit over the top. And it's interesting when, we don't have time to really talk about a place like Gallipoli, but the range of politics of remembrance, when you look at a place like Gallipoli, is just, it's probably bigger than Vimy, not just for the Australians, but for the Turks, and how they've replayed that. So I think because of the level of sensitivity there is around a place like Vimy Ridge, I think having any kind of reenactment, or what people might say is war play, would be the criticism leveled, might not happen there. I'm sure that it might occur in some field in British Columbia, or somewhere else in this country, where some kind of activity may occur. But in the sense of on the actual ground, I think we often view sites of war memory as sacred, hallowed ground. So I would see some kind of event that was similar to what we saw with the 100th, probably, because of the reputation that and mythology that we have around Vimy Ridge, it could be as significant, if not larger. The years ahead will tell. Vimy is that one event. We don't rally as much around, say, St. Julian or Mount Sorel or the last 100 days like we do Vimy. Vimy becomes that gateway into the First World War for many Canadians. And so, it will stand as that, the significance of the monument, all those things will just maintain it as a marker in Canadian heritage for a long, long time. I don't think we'll see anything. We won't see it coming down. We'll see those cemeteries there in 100 years. So I think that's what I would say.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Jeff. All right, that actually concludes the majority of the questions. I'd like to take the opportunity for anyone else who's still in the line, if they'd like to raise their hand, we can unmute you to ask a question. Maybe we'll just pause for a moment or two to see if anyone does that. I'm going to have to see if I can figure out Zoom to make sure I can see that. Okay, we actually have one extra question, and I guess this would, I'd say, is for Jeff. So you mentioned that in the 1920s, St. Julian in the Second Battle of Ypres was more important. Why do you think the emphasis shifted over the years from that?
Maybe Pat can help me with that one too. Well, I think I've heard Tim Cook speak on this a few times. I've read the book, and it just seems like there was this nuance. It wasn't like some sudden a moment. It was a gentle shift that started to pay greater attention to Vimy Ridge. I think a particular quote where someone started talking about it in the 60s as a birth of a nation. And I think over time there was a momentum. And Tim Cook actually says, as his last line in his book, which I always thought was very poignant. Just give me a second here. He always says that something to the effect of, the memorial is for the dead. Canada was indeed forever changed by the Great War, but Vimy did not make the nation. It was the nation that made Vimy. And the shift towards looking at Vimy Ridge as the birth of the nation, I think, is always validated by things like the 4 divisions were together. It was the first time for a lot of things for the Canadian Corps coming together. So in that way, there was lots of reason and rationale to say, if we're going to say anywhere is going to be the birth of the nation, it would be this one, because you had battalions from across the country that were represented, and all 4 divisions. Well, then the debate begins, right? As to other battles previous. So often the view of the Second Battle of Ypres was, of course, it was our baptism of fire. So where do you place the birth of the nation if you're going to use that term? Where does the debate pivot? So I don't know, Pat, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, thanks for, I do have a few thoughts. Professors always have thoughts. The switch, when you think about it, occurs very early because the decision is made in the early 20s that Vimy is going to be the memorial. Mm-hmm. And I think, the reasons then, well, to put it this way, I think Ypres suffered from firstitis, for lack of a better way of putting it. Like, it was the first battle, so it was the first one, but it couldn't stand up against the kind of all the arguments, and you've outlined them, I think, very well, Jeff. The fact that the whole army was there, so there was so many veterans that had vested interest in Vimy, for example, then their next of kin that had it in Second Ypres. So I think that early on, and this, it just does more, and we wouldn't be having this argument now, if you know what I mean. Like, we would say, well, Second Ypres was the first. That's all it's got going for it, basically. It's a defensive battle. And so on and so forth. And it doesn't even represent the nation at arms in the same way, in the sense that the first division in its initial incarnation was full of people who were veterans of the British Army and full of British immigrants, but mostly picked not because they were British so much, just because they had military experience in Britain and so on. And they were, I think, in the aftermath of the war, when this Canadianism, I mean, honest to God, legitimate, beginnings of Canadian nationalism had taken root, that recommended Vimy as well. That was the army of those who, it was more Canadian. I mean, the army was never more than about 50% Canadian born, but so that, and the fact that it was on a much bigger scale, and it won, I think, for reasons which are justifiable, and that decision was made, early on, really. And Second Ypres lost for reasons which are kind of readily identifiable, and no reflection on the importance of Second Ypres. But it just seems like, as I say, looking back at it now, what else would you have, which other battle would you have taken?
Yeah. And it's interesting when we talk about how we, the significance of the memorial, because it was often and early on identified that the Allward design warranted a hillside. There was thoughts around, well, if you were to put it in the flat landscape of Ypres, aside from Mount Sorel, which is relatively small given the size of the ridge, would it have that same power? And as many of us who've been there, when you go out into the Douai Plain and you look, south towards the memorial, it just really stands out. It just really makes a mark throughout the area. Local soccer teams will have the Vimy Memorial on their badge, and it's iconic in the area. And I think that really lends itself to something that is memorable. As much as I love the Clemshaw Memorial in St. Julian, it's hidden. It's hard to situate yourself as to where you are in the battlefield, and you really have to know how to read a map to understand the lay of the land for the Second Battle of Ypres. Whereas Vimy, it's pretty evident, right, when you're standing there. So I think that has all these benefits, as Pat said, to in the early days, to establish the growing significance of Vimy.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both. We do have another question here. And I think this I could open up to both. So maybe I'll ask Dr. Brennan to answer first and Dr. Bird second. What was the role of heritage and cultural backgrounds of the Canadian soldiers during Vimy and the CF? So in particular, Indigenous soldiers and their contributions, how prevalent was the multicultural? I know from my personal experience, the 10th Battalion speaks often of the Japanese Canadians who fought there with that battalion, and obviously there's Indigenous soldiers there as well. So perhaps, Dr. Brennan, if you could maybe remark on that.
Yeah, well, firstly, the whole army really represented Anglo-Canada. I mean, there were a lot of what we now call minorities, including ethnic Ukrainians and so on and so forth in the army, but most of these groups were discouraged quite strongly during the war. They filtered into the army, sometimes to prove their loyalty and so on, sometimes to better their situation, sometimes because their friends were doing it. I mean, but when it came to visible minorities, that it was a racist society. It was, and racist war effort. Now that said, Native Canadians were, originally discouraged and encouraged as we needed more men, and they served with distinction in the Army. There was no particular racism in the Army. They served in combat units, and they mixed in first Native person most of the white comrades I'd ever seen, and they fit in well, and they were not discriminated against until after the war. Then they were discriminated against plenty, but we know the story of Oriental Canadians. Japan was our ally, and they were seen as militaristic people. They would have been naturals, you would have thought, but they were strongly rejected in British Columbia, where most of them lived, and they were absorbed in some Alberta units, for example, for a time, because again, battalions were short of men when they were being raised here, and they took whatever they could get. The problem with a lot of the Japanese, and they were in the 50th Battalion too, was that they couldn't speak English, most of them. So it was a real problem. Any Japanese volunteer who could speak English had to become an NCO, and none of the officers were all white Euro Canadians. They couldn't speak Japanese, and so there was this terrible problem with replacing their NCOs and reinforcements in general. And eventually they were all turned into cooks and batmen. They fought very well for the time they fought and so on. But the problem with blacks, I think, is well understood now. More racism than anything. Generally speaking, the Japanese, though, and Native Canadians are the best example because they're the biggest group, frankly. I'm sure they are visible minorities. They serve within white units and serve well and are treated well. As I say, the problems became before the war, of course, in terms of discrimination, and after the war discrimination. But it was a positive experience in that sense, had a huge impact on the Native leadership of Native rights movement in the 1920s and 30s. A great many of them were war veterans. They had learned both pan-Indianness, for lack of a better term, that is to say, tribes and all of this stuff the whites used to characterize them didn't matter. If you were Aboriginal Canadian in one province, you were treated just as badly as you were in another province. In other words, that's how they had to look at themselves, and that they were the equal of the white man. And they weren't allowed to be the equal of the white man after the war, but it had a profound effect on Native soldiers, and they were respected. I know one of the great snipers of the First World War was in the 50th Battalion of the whole British Empire Forces, Henry Norwest, who was Métis, but he was widely respected by his white colleagues, who I'm sure, as a soldier and as a man, because he was a soldier, such a good soldier, he would not have been respected in 1913 by those same people. So there are positives about the experience, and they certainly were integrated. There was no effort to have an all Indian and all Native Aboriginal unit. If no other reason, it couldn't be reinforced, probably. Whereas New Zealand had Maori units in combat. So it was in that sense, it was a multicultural, multi-ethnic effort in the Army. It's just that a lot of the acceptance of people was driven by the need for reinforcements, and it didn't have much of an impact after the war. Several Japanese Canadians who served in Alberta units at the front in the First World War won the Military Cross were interned in 1942. So anyway,
Yeah.
I had to.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brennan. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I often imagine what the range of accents would have been like in a given battalion, and how rich it would have been to just listen. Everything across the British Isles, people that maybe had settled in Canada for a few generations, plus people from Europe, the odd maybe Dutch or Scandinavian that's there. And just that sense of identity formation that was occurring through a uniform and the wearing of a maple leaf by all these people. And you do find it when you search the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And a lot of the single guys, they would have their next of kin as their parents back in Scotland or that kind of thing. So definitely, when you dig into the Library and Archives Canada records, you can see people that have been in Canada for, say, 3, 4, 5 years, and then they're going overseas with the Canadians to fight. So in terms of one of the documentaries we did was with the Métis on their new war memorial in Batoche, and the title of it is called The Great Equalizer. And when we talked to the gang at Gabriel Dumont, who was doing some fantastic research on and the gang, I mean other scholars, Métis scholars, looking at who had fought in different wars, because of course, as Métis, they couldn't say they were Indian or they weren't white, so they would basically have to choose which one they would tick the box for. So that would often lead them to get lost. So the Batoche effort and the war memorial there was essentially to focus on trying to go by names and family stories to identify all the Métis that had fought in the war. And the Great Equalizer, as Pat says, by uniform, they were equal. After the war, they didn't necessarily get the same benefits, nor did they get access to, say, the Legion. Those kinds of things really showed the racism back in Civvy Street was quite distinct and certainly sad. So when I look at the virtues of the Allward Memorial, we also have to think of the context of the 20s, where we did have residential schools, we did have racism, we had a bunch of issues going on. So I often see them as virtues to which we aspire to, and that we have to think about a lot. And I think we do well at them in many cases.
Yeah, I think I was going to say part of the problem today is among those who believe that perfection has to be achieved immediately in these issues. I don't think do give a fair voice to the achievements that were made at the time, and the changes that occurred, subtle and not as quick as we would have liked, and so on and so forth. You also just one last quick point about the Vimy Memorial, the unknowns. One of the things you can see, there's many interesting things you can see about from the names, but one is you'll see a name like John Anderson, and then in brackets it'll say Swiderski, and where he lied about his name to enlist because he was from a less desirable group, and there was plenty of that went on, which tells you all sorts of things, some good and some not so good, but some good too, that he wanted to serve and he was being Canadianized, if you like, by the process, and presumably his comrades, who would have known perfectly well from his accent that he wasn't Anderson, learned something about the so-called new Canadians, as they were called politely at the time.
Excellent. We have a follow-up to that question, which I think will be our final question for the evening. And I'm not sure we have expertise for this, but we'll ask the question and see what everybody knows. Why was the Canadian approach different than the New Zealand approach? For example, the All Maori Battalion and a similar All Indigenous Battalion here in Canada?
Well, firstly, my understanding, as I just reviewed a book that deals with these issues, is that the Maoris were behind getting the All Maori Battalion. They were going to be used as labor troops. For example, what we used the famous 2nd Construction Battalion of African Canadian troops for, which was a dismissive kind of role and spoke of not acknowledging their manliness and so on and so forth. And it was the Maoris that wanted that, and they received that, and there was enough of them in the population, enough apparently willing to serve, largely for gaining rights for the Maori themselves post-war or during the war and post-war, that they could reinforce it. Okay, and Maoris also served in white units. There was never that kind of organized sense of unity among Aboriginal Canadians. That's the thing, and the war helps to create some of that among those who serve, that they have more in common, Cree with Iroquois and so on, than they ever dreamed. I mean, they're all, as far as the whites are concerned, they're just Indians, and so pan-Indianness has to be, as it was called in the 20s by native groups, has to be developed. So it was that different situation. They didn't see themselves as one entity to even ask for that kind of right. Whether it would have been granted is another matter.
Thank you, Jeff. Do you have anything to add there?
Just one small point. Just as it's interesting if you read "Death So Noble" by Jonathan Vance, and he speaks about Joseph Brant, who was a descendant of a great chief. He was with the 4th Battalion. He died on the 22nd or 23rd of April, 1915. And he was a very important figure to talk about in Max Aitken's book, In Flanders Fields, because there was a real effort to try to build out war art, which is, of course, another project of Aitken, where he was trying to memorialize Canada's efforts. And he wanted to be able to link it backwards into earlier times of the settlement of Canada and the involvement of Indigenous people in wars. And so Joseph Brant was that link. And so often, there's a very complex relationship, I think, between Indigenous involvement in the Canadian Army and memorialization. And so it is really quite a big story. And there's, I'm thinking about the book, was it For King in Canada, which was done by Tim Weingard, which might be of interest to some people. And there may be some other books out there. I think it's an area that really could do with some more research. Yeah.
Agreed.
Excellent. Well, I think that's the last question I have on my list. And we've been at this now for 2.5 hours. So I think we're going to bring this to a conclusion. So I'd like to thank and ask everybody to virtual round of applause for Dr. Brennan, Dr. Bird, and Dr. Jones, who was obviously just not involved in the question and answer, for, I believe, bringing some very new insights into the Battle of Vimy Ridge. We learned about the grand strategic piece of it and how really the Battle of Arras was a bit of a diversion. We learned some of the misconceptions from Dr. Brennan around the fighting and not being an all-Canadian effort. And then in particular, Dr. Bird on some very insightful looks at remembrance and how that's evolved over time. So thank you very, very much for taking part in the evening. And I guess a round of applause. I know